Right, hello everyone. What have we got on the chat so far? Discussions about food, lunch, crocheting, bike riding. Oh, lovely, fantastic, all good stuff. How is everybody? Hope you're okay. I do apologise. I've got that sort of frizzy hair, I think they call it today. It's this blooming rain, just havoc with me. So yeah, welcome everybody. I'm going to get started in 2 ticks. Just want to really test to make sure that everyone can hear me and see me, which is obviously really important. Marie, you're saying you can't hear me. Can anyone else hear me? You can hear me, Katie? And Michelle can, and Annabelle can. So Marie, you just might want to have a look at your speaker to see whether you've got your speaker turned off. As long as everyone can hear and see me, then we'll get started. I can see lots of your lovely faces, which is wonderful. I won't try and look at all 56 of you, but you're all there, which is amazing. So what we'll do today is obviously we'll run through a presentation, which I think I've called Can We Get Lost? We're going to run through that and explain to you obviously what it means in terms of short-time working and layoff, which is what we call lost, and what it might mean to you in your setting. What we will also do is obviously I'm going to open up to for conversation, for chat. So if anyone's got any questions they want to ask, then I'm going to open it up for that as well, so that you've really got the opportunity to ask any questions that you might have as well. So we'll do the presentation and then we'll open it up for questions and we'll see how we get on for time. I think I'm good until 2 o'clock. So we should have plenty of time to cover some ground, and obviously this is recorded, so it'll be available for you to watch again at your pleasure, at your leisure even. So I'm going to share my screen now. Let's go to this, share screen, and do that. So you should be able to see my presentation as well as obviously see my hear me and as well. So you should be able to hear me and see my presentation. So what I'm going to do is just go through all of this with you and we'll see where we get. I will be able to still see any chat that comes up. So do let me know if there's any questions that you have, and we'll come to the questions after the presentation. So can we get lost? First of all, a bit of background about myself. If you've not come across my work before, I started Red Wing Solutions back in May 2004. So we are 16 years old the week after next. We specialise in HR for early years. We will work with other businesses. We do work with other businesses in other sectors. And the beauty of that is it feeds into the work that we do with yourselves. So things that we've learned to use in our contracts for early years, I have to say I've been inspired by other sectors that have had similar issues to yourselves before we've had them with yourselves. So we love the fact that we have a varied customer base. 75% of it is early years, but that 25% we do love working with. We're a small team. We were based in Redditch in an office until 5 weeks ago. We're all now scattered out, which we've got used to be fair. It's amazing how quickly you get used to something, isn't it? So we're now all working from home, but we are a small team. And don't let the fact that we're based in Worcestershire fool you. We work with customers across the UK, as far up in Scotland as you can get, and as far down in the southwest as you can get as well. So, you know, we're really quite able with technology to be able to work with people anywhere. It's no barrier for us. I personally have been in HR for 28 years, and all the people that we work with are experienced as well. So I wouldn't like to think how many hundreds of years experience we have. And we've seen a few things, but I don't think anybody who works in HR, if they're honest, has ever known a period of 6 weeks that we've just worked through. You know, if you have any friends who work in HR, they're probably very frazzled right now, because I know I am. We've never known a time quite like this in terms of looking after employees and looking after businesses. We do work obviously with early years clients, and so if you are thinking of working with us, our retained clients range from employers who've got less than 10 employees to well over 100, and our assistance, our team delivers is really looking after you, and we call that telephone support, Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. the phones go on till 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Monday to Friday, 51 weeks of the year. We do close in the gap between Christmas and New Year, and we're there really to support the business owner, their nursery manager. Sometimes if it's a larger chain, then there'll be an area manager, but we're there to support and provide assistance and to make sure that obviously everything you need to do, you can do, and you do it legally and well, really. So my objectives for this session, really, you know, I developed this session out of the back of the session that we did, I think it was nearly 2 weeks ago now, wasn't it, called Considering Redundancies. So this idea that you might be considering redundancies in your business, this idea of let's look at alternatives to redundancies came out of that session. So this session has come out of that, and I'd like by the end of this session for you to have an understanding. Now I'm looking at my screen, I've got my slides here. I'd like you to have an understanding of what we mean by short time working. For many people, me included, the last time we used it in any numbers was 2009, so 11 years ago. And that's when obviously we had the economic recession, the banking, coming out of the banking crisis, and we had a number of mainly manufacturing companies who needed to lay off staff and to place them on short time working. So we'll talk today about obviously where you might have seen these terms. We'll talk about obviously what it means if you haven't got those terms in your contract. But I'd like you to understand it this afternoon and understand how it can be used as an alternative to furlough and what options it gives you if you were to use it, but also which downsides come with it. I'd like you to understand the risks, which is kind of where downsides comes, and obviously understand the range of options that exist for you, because you are all different, and what might work for one setting might not work for you. What somebody might decide to do might be what you decide not to do. And I do think there's sometimes a pressure to feel that, well, if someone else is doing it, they might be onto something, and I might be missing a trick if I don't adopt that. But I do want you all to think as individual businesses. Just because someone else is doing it doesn't mean to say you need to do it. And we shouldn't be looking at other people and thinking that what they're doing must be right, because sadly, and we've seen this a lot on social media recently, some people will choose to do something because of their level of risk. They might be quite comfortable with risk. You might not be. And they might be prepared to take a chance that something might be okay and you might not be. And you might be in a position where you shouldn't do that. So again, do look at what other people are doing, but don't always feel that you have to do what others are doing. You are all running separate entities. So those are my objectives for this afternoon. So we ought to talk about my favourite F word, or my second favourite F word, if I'm being honest. We ought to talk about furlough first. Furlough obviously is something that arrived in our dialogue on the 20th of March. Before then, it was a term that many of us would have thought we kind of knew of, in the sense of it was a term that was perhaps from overseas, it was a naval term, and it kind of meant a time when you were being paid by your employer but not working. Now, Boris could have called it anything he chose to call it, but he chose to pick on the word furlough. But furlough has no concept in UK employment law. It doesn't exist. So the 5.5 sides of A4 that we had the following Monday on the job retention scheme was all any of us have ever had on what furlough meant and what it meant under the job retention scheme. We'd never had it before, so that's all we received. And you'll have heard me talk at the time that how difficult it is to give advice to employers when you've got 5.5 sides of A4 as guidance, when we haven't got a piece of legislation to refer to or case law that says how the legislation has been interpreted in the courts. Very, very difficult times indeed. But the premise was that the employees would be furloughed from companies that were facing an impact because of the coronavirus pandemic. And initially the idea was you would furlough staff whose roles had become at risk of redundancy due to the pandemic. And then latterly the language has softened to say that, suggesting really that the roles have been impacted because of the pandemic. So the language has changed over the time. So we can furlough more people legitimately now than we could have done when the scheme first started. That's the premise. Well, furlough has been brought in a way so that all of a sudden, all of the businesses that Boris told to close didn't have to make staff redundant, and those people were then entering the job market as unemployed. He believed, and other countries had done it in Europe, and I think the day we learned of Boris's plans, we'd heard of Denmark's plans at 75% and thought, that's crazy, that's a big sum of money. And of course, Boris does one better and goes to 80. So the day that it was launched, it was all about, please don't make redundancies, please have jobs for people to go back to. And if you furlough, then maybe that's a possibility. I think many employees feel that by being furloughed, their employers will never need to make them redundant. And I'm afraid there are employees who are starting to learn from their employers due to the number of people who might be made redundant. They're starting to learn now that that's actually not going to be a reality, that whilst the employer's wages are being supported, their wage bill, to make a business operate, there's lots of other bills, there's lots of other overheads, and just having support with your wage bill doesn't mean that you'll be able to survive. And so we saw yesterday that British Airways announced 12,000 redundancies, and that will be because they need to give over 45 days consultation before the first redundancy notices are given. Well, they can't wait until the end of furlough to be able to start that process. They need to do it now in the hope that perhaps they'll have a cash injection and be able to avoid so many redundancies during the consultation process and down the line. So furlough is meant to try and avoid redundancies having to be made at the end of March, and it has achieved that. What I also think is important to bear in mind is that any businesses who then go on to make redundancies, if they can show that they tried to use the furlough scheme to avoid it happening initially, that's in some ways a suggestion that you've done what you needed to do to avoid a redundancy. I think businesses who don't furlough, and there have been some who chose never to use the scheme, will not have that same argument, and it might be levelled at them by the judge as to why didn't you furlough any of your staff before you then decided to make redundancies? Did you really try to avoid redundancies in the way in which other companies in your sector, other companies of similar size to you, did try? So it's a good thing that if you've used furlough. So we were bumbling along with our furlough agreements, helping lots of businesses, and you'll notice that our furlough agreement, when it came out, it had an unpopular section towards the back end of the furlough agreement, which talked about the fact that if you were if furlough came to an end, the employer might need to place you on short-time working or layoff. Now, you know, obviously for employers without the clauses in their contract, that may well prove in the future to be very useful indeed. But of course, we needed to protect the employers. And once you're varying the terms and conditions to introduce the concept of furlough, you might as well introduce other things that would be helpful to the employer to be able to secure as many jobs as possible at the same time. And then we got to the 17th of April, a day I don't think any of us will forget. I put the oven on at 5 o'clock, quite happy in the knowledge that we could have staff on holiday whilst during furlough. So it was an end of a good week, if you like. We'd now got that clarity that when an employee was on furlough, they could be on holiday. We were starting to think about how that would work for our clients. So I popped the oven on at 5 o'clock, quite a happy bunny. Sat down at 6:30 to eat said dinner, not quite such a happy bunny, because like all of you, at 6:30, we learned the news that actually the U-turn had happened and that the government was now going to require the employers in your sector to offset funding against any future claim for the job retention scheme, a portal which was going to open 48 hours later on Monday morning at 7 a.m. So that was a weekend I don't think any of us will forget in a hurry, and not a pleasant time for any of us at all. So we are where we are. You've all probably spent the last 10 days thinking about obviously how you claim, whether you're going to claim at all, whether you're going to claim and hope it's right, or whether you've worked out your figures and claimed for what you're entitled to. I hope many of you have sought advice from your accountants, from payroll specialists, and anyone who can assist you to do this. And that obviously that work has now happened and that you've done your claim for April. So where we are now is obviously thinking May and May onwards. And so for many people, what I want to say to you is that next week represents a situation where you're now in a new pay period, in May's pay period. And for many of you, you're starting to think about what's the long-term use of furlough for me? When will I need to use, if at all, other options that are available to me? So let's talk about the first one of those two terms that we talk about. Let's talk about layoff. Well, layoff clauses, they live in your contract of employment. I think somebody asked on one of my groups whether I thought that a common law apprentice could be laid off. Well, a common law apprentice is the form of apprenticeship that it is most difficult for the employer to get out of. So an employer who employs a common law apprentice will struggle to lose that apprentice unless they do an act of very gross misconduct. So you would need to take advice if that's you. I can't think who it was. I don't know whether there was somebody said it was for them or for somebody else, but you would need to take specific advice on that contract to see what options are available to you. And I would have thought it highly unlikely that a layoff clause will exist in a common law apprenticeship. It's much more common for a contract of employment, and a common law apprenticeship is not a contract of employment. So layoff clauses, they live in the contract of employment, and in our case with the Red Wing furlough agreement, they live in there too. Think of layoff as buying you time for the need to otherwise make redundancies. So rather than need to make redundancies, you could lay off workers to buy you the time, and then whilst they're still being your employees and they still need to be ready for work and they still need to be accruing holiday and all those lovely things, you're buying time before that decision needs to be made. And that's why it was very popular during the last banking crisis, because it was very sudden and very quick that we had a problem in our manufacturing companies and they were unable to work. So they had to lay people off very quickly indeed. So they went from being on a full 5-day working week to perhaps a 3-day working week. So short time working with 2 layoff days. And that happened, as I say, overnight. Let's look at the other term. So lost is made up of layoff and short time. So the other term is short time. Now, technically, short time again will be in the contracts of employment and or the furlough agreement, and are often together. They live in the same place. And it means that you're giving staff less hours than you would normally give them in their contract of employment. So 10 out of 10 for those that realise that if you've got a 0 hours contract, you will probably never have this clause in their agreement, in their contract, because a 0 hours contract, you're not guaranteeing them any hours at all. So why would you need to place them on short time or layoff? So short time means giving somebody less. Now, if we give them less than 50% of their hours, they get the same rights as somebody who's laid off in relation to what that period of short time or layoff can mean for them. So short time is anything less than what they would normally be working, but think of short time having rights being less than 50% of what they would normally work. So if you gave somebody 20 hours and they were normally contracted for 37.5, they wouldn't get the option to apply for redundancy after 4 weeks. If you gave them 16 hours, something like that, they would, because it's less than half. So basically, when we transition from furlough away to something else as a new option, we have to end one agreement before we commence a new one. So what I want you to think is, obviously, if you chose to not use furlough, you would end that furlough agreement. You would then be putting staff on a new agreement, which wouldn't be furlough, which would be potentially that you were putting them on short time working, or you were going to lay them off. So you would end one and start another. There are other people who might need to, by the way they've written their furlough agreements, they might need to rewrite to their staff to say, we initially told you 3 weeks, we're now telling you a further 3 weeks. But that's not been so common in early years. We've always had open-ended furlough agreements because we've wanted that from the start. But you do need to end the agreement to enter into a new agreement. And we should always be honest with our staff about what their status is. It would be unfair, wouldn't it, if you were an employee to perceive you were on furlough and then to discover at payroll that you were on short time. So we have to treat people decently and to take them along with us on this journey, and to seek their understanding as to what's happening to them. I was going to say seek their agreement, but if you've already got the right, there is no agreement to seek. Right, let's move to the next slide. So short time, this is where you place employees on short time and they work for their money. Now, there is two trains of thought. There is a train of thought that perhaps you pay somebody for an agreed amount of time, and it's called short time because it's less than they would otherwise receive. But you might not need them to physically work in your workplace for all of those hours. You might decide that you want them to be at home undertaking certain activities for you, or preparing certain activities for you, or undertaking certain training for you, and you want to call that work. And then you want to also have them in the workplace doing something that might not be their normal job, but is in the range of reasonable duties to give them. Or you might want to have a situation where they're perhaps working with the children on a rota basis for the children of key workers that you're working with. When it comes to you reopening, you might not believe that you will open as strongly as you closed. And so you might decide to have half the workforce in the morning and the other half of the workforce in the afternoon, and therefore people are on short time because they've got reduced hours. That also might be part of your social distancing strategies, because who's to say that we won't still have to do that when we do return to the new normal. So short time is basically saying to somebody, you agree that I will pay you less and you will work less, yeah? And you could be paid more than you work as long as they've agreed to be paid less and work less. And that's how it works. And if you give them 50% of their hours or less, they have other options. So with layoff, you get statutory guarantee payments. Now these went up to £30 on the 1st of April. So if you heard me talk about layoff in March, I would have talked about £29. It's paid £30 is the minimum. You can agree to lay somebody off and pay them more. So again, layoff could be used by yourselves if you decided to lay off your staff but not require them to do any work, and you could pay them a sum of money that you would call a guarantee payment. It would be your company's guarantee payment that could be higher than the statutory minimum. The principles of the statutory minimum is that it is paid for up to 5 days, and it's paid up to 5 days if you work 5 days. So if your contract is 5 days a week, you could receive £150. If your contract is 3 days a week, you could receive £90. And to be eligible for guarantee pay, you have to have been classed as an employee. You have to work for that employer for at least a month. So all of these things, given where we are, will be applicable to you, because there won't be any new starters who would be laid off by yourselves at this stage in the process. There may have been when we first obviously learned that this business of closing nurseries and schools was going to be muted. They have to be available for work. So if they have took another job, then obviously they need to be able to come back to work for yourself if they're required to do so. They can't reasonably refuse alternative work that you give to them. Again, you would perhaps ask them to do something that would be consistent within their skill set, and you would ask them to, you would have to be reasonable as to what you ask. You couldn't be unreasonable. And clearly they can't have been laid off because of industrial action. So those are the same rules on guarantee pay that would exist for anybody in any sector. And the other thing you need to know about layoff is that after they've been laid, when they're laid off as part of a short time working situation, so where you lay them off for 2 or 3 days a week and pay them for 2 days a week, then they have those days that are then considered workless days. Now, if you were put on short time working and worked 5 mornings, you wouldn't have any workless days in a week. Whereas if you were placed on short time working but worked Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and you would normally work Thursday, Friday, you would have 2 workless days in a week. And you could try and claim benefits for those workless days. And so they would be approaching universal credit, which we know is means tested, but they would be approaching them to see if they could be entitled to any benefits on their workless days. So some HR consultants talk about it being, more generous, more supportive of your workforce if you place people on a contract, a short time working relationship, where they are perhaps working some days and then having workless days on others, as being kinder than making somebody have no workless days and being in for the same number of days, but actually working less hours each day. But either works, it's whatever you need in your business. After 4 weeks of being laid off or on short time that's less than 50%, the employee can claim redundancy pay. And this is important to factor into your thinking, because they can claim the redundancy pay from you. They can write to you. There's a very complicated procedure, but they write to you and say, I've been laid off for 4 weeks. I wish to claim my redundancy pay. And then you've got a short period of time which you can write back to them. And it's what we call serving counter notice, that actually you're not going to pay redundancy pay because you're going to lift this arrangement within a certain short period of time. So it's either 4 weeks continuous, or if they're laid off for 6 weeks in a 13-week period, are the rules. So you can rotate layoff. You can have people laid off for a period of time and then bring them back and then lay them off again. But again, you know, what suits you and what suits your business might not suit someone else's. But do bear in mind, just as we can rotate furlough, we can rotate layoff. And when choosing people to place on short-time working or layoff, we've got to be very fair. It is very emotive, especially on the back of furlough, to place people on short-time working and layoff, as I'm sure you can imagine. So you've got to demonstrate a fair selection criteria as to what's driven you to choose the options you've chosen. So let's say you've chosen to keep somebody on furlough. Maybe that's because of their circumstances. Their situation has meant that you've kept them on that. Perhaps other people, you've chosen to bring them back into the workplace and work and pay and be paid for their normal hours. That may be because they're the most qualified person you have. They may well be the most experienced person you have. They may well be the most capable of working independently or in a small team and making the decisions that you need to be made. So that would be, you'd need to be able to demonstrate a fair selection criteria as to why that person was chosen and why somebody else, perhaps in a similar role, was put on short-time working or laid off. What you don't want is people to turn around and say that your decisions of who's to go on short-time working or layoff have been discriminatory. Because as you know, employees need no service at all to claim that the employer's actions have been discriminatory. You don't even need to be an employee to claim discrimination at an employment tribunal. So we do have to be quite careful when you're selecting who to do this to and who not. Anyone with a protected characteristic could claim discrimination. So protected characteristics include obviously disabilities, and some of those will be hidden. So an employee status of disabled may not be the same as obviously somebody telling you that they're disabled. So a disability in employment context will be things that are long-term, that have a day-to-day impact in their ability to handle day-to-day activities. And it could be that whilst they've not been sick from you for 12 months, the nature of what's wrong with them might well last 12 months. And I was having a chat with somebody this week, and they'd got an employee who's been off with a mystery health problem since December, and I think their current sick note took them until the end of June. Well, that would be 7 months since they've been off. I think in anyone's language, there is a great suggestion that that person would be off for 12 months if they've been off for 7. So that's likely to be potential disability. And therefore, any decisions we make about that person, we've got to be mindful that they may well possess a protected characteristic. We just haven't had it confirmed yet. So always seek advice on any selection method you draw up as to who to place on short time and who to lay off, and who to have working normally and who to perhaps have remain on furlough. My favourite topic of the year, well, the usual favourite topic of the year would be holidays, or as we like to call them in this family, hollybobs. And you know that holidays continue during furlough. We've already mentioned that news was mentioned on the 17th. But obviously holidays accrue when you are laid off or on short time, and you're accruing it on the contract that you have with your employer. So if you're a full-time 40 hours a week contract, your holidays being accrued on your full-time 40-hour-a-week contract, not on the reduced hours that you're working. So that's worth bearing in mind. So we know that holidays still accrue. And we know that obviously an alternative exists called unpaid authorised leave. So your staff who you perhaps wish to consider the options for, they may well be staff members, and I think this has happened in relation to coming off furlough and being asked to return to work. As you can imagine, more and more businesses are doing that now, are asking their staff to return from furlough. And we've had some lovely excuses. I don't know if any of you saw the one about the puppy. I hope you did. But yes, somebody's come back and said, no, I can't come back. I've had a new puppy. And that then spread to a lot of photographs of a lot of you guys have also had new puppies join the family as well. So that was a lovely thread. But we've had some interesting excuses. And I think others have been told things like, no, I'm a bit busy at the minute. I've had a bit of a few weeks. I'd rather not. And people will refuse, literally will refuse to return. And one of the reasons they might refuse might be on the basis of health and safety. So their refusal is driven by a fear that they won't be safe if they're back at work. And I've already said this a lot of times, so I know that it won't be something that's new to you. But if someone's going to suggest that the working environment might be unsafe, your best bet is to give them authorised unpaid leave, because health and safety is such an area that it's often very hard to argue with somebody that's got it in their minds that it would be unsafe to be back at work. And I wouldn't recommend disciplining somebody for their refusal to return to work if their grounds are going to be strongly held belief of health and safety. So what you might have is somebody who comes to you and says, look, I would like to take some of my parental leave. Now, we don't see a lot of use of parental leave, do we? And particularly in early years, even though you've got a lot of parents in the sector. And I think there's a lot of a belief that the government has done a lot with parental leave to introduce it into legislation, but by it being unpaid, a lot of people just can't afford to take it. Now, we get up to 18 weeks parental leave for every child that we have. So if you have twins, you get twice the amount for, the same amount for each child. So it's one of those situations where people will perhaps be now thinking, maybe I'm going to take some of my parental leave. Because if you imagine you're a parent of a child of I don't know, let's think an 8-year-old. So right now you've probably got Ofsted inadequate for your homeschooling. You're struggling to try and do what you need to do the best you possibly can. Wouldn't you prefer if your employer said to you, remain on furlough? If they then come back to you and say, actually, we'd like you back at work, you've then presented with an issue of what do you do for childcare? What do you do to provide the continuation of the homeschooling when you're not there, you're at work? So you might decide to then take parental leave. That means then you'll be saying to your employer, I'm out of the picture now, I'd like to be considered on parental leave, because parental leave isn't booked in odd days unless the child is disabled, it's booked in full weeks. So somebody could request up to 4 weeks in a 12-month period. So they could go and make a request to you for 2 weeks parental leave, which might then say, I'll be out for 2 weeks, I'll be unpaid, but it will be parental leave coming off my 18 weeks total during the lifetime of my child. But I will know that I won't be going to work and I won't be being phoned up and asked to return in 24 hours. And that degree of certainty lets the employee feel that they're back in control. So that might be something we see. And it might be something your employees aren't aware of. And so therefore it might be a good idea to suggest to them, if anyone wants to take any parental leave, then again, do they know how to use the procedure that you have in your handbook? Are they aware of its use? Knowing that somebody's off and therefore you being able to plan is always more desirable than wondering whether when you ring them to unfurlough them, whether they'll take your call. And it'll be better for someone to choose to take parental leave than you having to lay them off. Much better for you and much better for them. So there may be others who volunteer to be off. Now, again, when you are considering strategies that may well lead to you having to try and avoid making redundancies, again, speaking to your workforce about what you might need to do may lead some people to decide, actually, I understand what you're saying to me, employer. Could I volunteer to take some unpaid time off? Again, authorised unpaid leave. That employee might again feel that they're saving other people's jobs, that they're saving you having to lay off someone else. So in a close-knit business, that again may be very attractive for people to say, I feel I can give up some money, perhaps for the next 6 weeks. And if that helps you, then I'd be happy to do that because I'm in a position to do so. And that hopefully will mean that you don't have to impact so many other people. But you've got to be honest with your workforce about what you're thinking for that to be raised by others. That leads us to talk about voluntary redundancy. So again, when we are thinking about our options, if you can at all seek volunteers before you go to compulsory redundancy, you will always benefit. Now, what do we mean by having a voluntary redundancy scheme? Well, that means writing to your employees and setting out that you are seeking volunteers. So what you would do is to open up a scheme. So say on Monday, the 4th of May, you decided to write to all your staff explaining that you may need to consider redundancies in the future, but as an initial step, you'd like to see if anyone would like to be considered for voluntary redundancy. You would send everybody the same letter, and in the letter would be the application form. And say you would give them until Friday at noon to apply. You would basically have them register their application, their interest in perhaps knowing what their voluntary redundancy might look like. So it would mean that once the scheme had closed for that week, you would then contact the employees who'd put their name forward, and you would then speak to them about what their redundancy package would look like and what you are going to do to incentivise the voluntary process. So it might be that you put in an extra £250 into the pot for them to receive if they chose to volunteer. Now, the employees who decide to choose to go for voluntary may well do so because they know that if it was compulsory, that they might well be at risk of losing their job. They'll recognise potentially that they might be better off to volunteer and to get the little bit extra than it would be for them to wait for you to make them compulsory redundant. With voluntary redundancy, you're also in control. So you've chosen for you to put your application in. You've therefore got 1 foot half out the door, but you do know that your employer may not accept your application. The employer will have made it very clear in their letter to you that there's no responsibility on behalf of the employer to accept everyone's application, and there's no responsibility on behalf of the employee to accept the offer that's made to them. So they like to be in control, and they do get that with voluntary redundancy. You also, with the rest of the workforce, don't get what's called survivor syndrome. When people survive a compulsory redundancy, so, if it's a selection criteria that's applied, they don't score badly, and therefore they're not invited for high risk consultation, they're not then given notice. They can feel a lot of anxiety about the fact that they survived, and it could be a question of waiting until next time when they're not so lucky. So you do end up with a very unsettled workforce after redundancy. You can avoid that with voluntary redundancy. There's something about this idea in our minds that our colleagues that have left through voluntary redundancy chose to have that happen to them, and therefore we can be happy for them that their applications were accepted. So it impacts people differently psychologically when there's been a voluntary scheme. So I would recommend you think about that. And calculating redundancy pay, again, what I want to remind you of with regard to redundancy, and again, it's a subject of a whole separate webinar, is that you don't get redundancy unless you've got 2 years service. It'll be statutory unless your contracts say differently, and some very few might enhance redundancy in their contracts and in their policies. The general principle is that it's very discriminatory. You get 1 week redundancy pay for every year of service up until the age of 41. It's capped at 500 and something pounds a week. I can never remember how it changes every April. I think it might be 538, something around that figure. But it's a large number. But you can't receive that unless you earn over that. If you earn £400 a week, then a week's pay, if you're 35, would be £400. It's 1.5 over 41 weeks. And there's a nice reckoner on the government's website that you can put in someone's start date and the date that you're thinking that they'll be made redundant, their weekly wages, and you press the button and it tells you what their redundancy pay would be. And remember, with redundancy pay, it's tax-free. So there is an incentive for somebody, obviously, when they receive redundancy pay, that they won't be taxed or national insured on that amount. So that's obviously quite nice for anyone with more than 2 years service. Gosh, I've spoken for 38 minutes. So before we take questions, obviously, wanted to say to you that if you did think about working with us, I think Alison was on the call somewhere. You might be there, Alison. But Alison's been a customer, I think, for more than 3 years, but she's been a customer for a while, and she wrote this lovely review for us earlier last month, I think, or late last month. And if we can be any assistance to you, if you wanted to book a strategy call so that we could look at personally your situation, then the best way of doing that is via our website shop, which is at redwing-solutions.co.uk/shop. And you can book a call with ourselves and we'll go through your own personal situation and what you need, what plans you need to draw up. Okay, so have a slurp of my coffee. So let's go back to not sharing my screen, and then I will be able to see your lovely selves and your questions. Let's see. Chat. Ah, there we go. So let's have a look and see what questions you've posed. Okay. So, question. I've just started the consultation process yesterday for redundancies as I can't keep paying staff with the percentage changing. So that's not a question, that's a statement, but yes, no, absolutely. Consultation is a process, and it's really important to obviously talk to the staff about what you're thinking. And obviously, depending on numbers, depends on whether there is any requirement for you to consult for a certain number of days. So anyone whose redundancy is less than 20 employees, there isn't the requirement to have a redundancy consultation period in law, but if it's over that, then there are. Sue's saying, when on holiday, on furlough, do organisations use to make up? Yes, they do, Sue. So they make it up to basically, if they're paying 80% as furlough, they would make it up to 100% of someone's normal salary. So if it was holiday in April, it would be what they would normally earn on that day in April. With statutory guarantee payments, what about play groups? So they work 5 hours a day for 3 days. It would be 3 days money. So if that didn't represent £30, so 5 hours a day, I would imagine is more than £30. But if it didn't, say that somebody was an apprentice and 5 hours only represented £25, then that would be the maximum of their statutory guarantee payment for that day, Alison. But you're right, it would only be for 3 days if they only worked 3 days. So it would only be 90, not the 150. Can I lay somebody off on SSP? SSP, if it's come first, would obviously mean that they weren't available for work. So you wouldn't lay them off whilst they were on SSP. You would continue to pay the £94, £95 a week SSP. Can I ask them to take parental leave? Can we ask them to take annual leave instead of to use up leave? You can definitely tell people about parental leave. You can't ask them to take it. As I say, the benefit they get with parental leave is that then they're not going to be bothered by you during the period that you've agreed they're on parental leave. You can definitely ask staff to take annual leave. This is called giving notice of your intention for them to take annual leave. And you do that, which is by a letter. And Olivia, I think you've probably had that letter, and you basically write to them to give them double the amount of notice of the holiday that you wish them to take. So if you wish them to take 2 weeks leave, you give them 4 weeks notice. Marie says, staff on universal credits, can you lay off these people? Well, you wouldn't know whether they were on universal credits or not. If they had told you and disclosed this to you, it shouldn't come into your thinking as to whether you lay them off or not. What you might find is if they're eligible for benefits already, when it comes to being laid off, all that might do would be to increase their eligibility for benefits. I've heard that many people who've gone to apply for benefits have been told, I'm sorry, you can't have any because of your partner's income. So, you know, that may well be good news for somebody who's already on the benefit. Can you make a pregnant member staff redundant? I think you mean, Marie. You can. It is messy. I have done it a couple of times in my career, usually when the place of work is closing. At other times, it's very, very tricky. And if somebody is pregnant, they don't have the rights that they have when they're on maternity leave, which is a weird one. But you actually get more rights when you're on maternity leave than when you're pregnant. But an employer will often have to make a redundant employee, a pregnant employee redundant, and end up paying all of the redundancy, all of the pregnancy money, all the maternity pay that they would have otherwise received, because depending on how pregnant they are, depends on whose liability it is to make that maternity pay. It can often be the employer's. So yeah, something that can happen, not nice to have to do it. What if they haven't worked for 2 years? Then there is still layoff and short time available to you, Katie, but obviously redundancy wouldn't attract a statutory redundancy payment. How can we afford redundancy pay? Again, that depends on your own financial situation. If you can't afford your liabilities and you're a limited company, you can find yourself obviously trading illegally, if you like. Probably not the best word to use, but you can find yourself trading where you shouldn't be as directors, and that can cause you all sorts of problems. But again, something perhaps we can help individually, Julia, on a call. Is there a maximum amount of weeks of unpaid authorised leave? No, not at all. I've known people, again, as soon as this process started, as soon as, you know, this kicked off, shall we say, turned to their employers and said, look, you know, I need to have some time off, and I think you do need some time off as well. So let's just agree, I'll see you in 10 weeks. And some people have literally, that's what they've done. So yeah, there's no limit on unpaid authorised leave. But think of it as a sabbatical. People do that. I think, Sue, you had an employee who did that. Can someone that's on sick leave be part of a consultation? Yes, depends what's wrong with them, but we have to modify our consultation process now anyway, because we are furloughed and we're in lockdown. So there is a plan of how we do it, and there is a means of doing it. It's not as desirable as we would be if we were all in work. What's the process for short timing staff? Again, it's about writing to the staff to place them on short time. And if you've got the contractual right, we refer to that in the letter. If it's not, it's in the agreement, we refer to the agreement. If staff are on short time, do staff accrue full holidays? Yeah, I answered that. It's definitely full. It's based on their normal contract. If I need to bring back a member of staff from furlough, but only need them for on short time, they could end up being paid less. Well, yes, that could be the reality. So you're ending the furlough agreement and having them back on short time, they're going to be worse off. Yeah, difficult conversation for you to have with that employee. I would say that if you want them to be working, you're probably going to end up paying them more than they actually work. And people have done that. They've paid them more than they're working. There's no incentive for the employee to return from furlough if they're going to earn less. So they may well make it difficult for you in their conversations with you, so we say, but have to speak to you separately about that. If short time and layoffs are included in the employee handbook and in their contracts, agreeing to the terms in the handbook, we don't know, Sivatri, I'd have to have a look. I always like to see something in the contract rather than just in the handbook. Can I make redundancy on SSP? Yes, you can. But again, you have to follow the process. Marianne, is there a maximum percentage of hours you can reduce somebody by? No, people can go from 40 down to 4. I've seen it happen. How long do people stay on redundancy? Is it until the business picks up? Well, if you've been made redundant, you've gone, Lenny. In terms of layoff, some people will be laid off for some considerable period of time. Can staff do videos to keep in touch with children be classed as training? No, Matthew. It's still providing a service for your children and you will be breach of furlough, but you could do it if they were on short time working, and that may be the benefit to the employer by getting them to do work they wouldn't normally do from home. And you paying them the same amount. It depends on your percentages as to whether it's worth your while claiming under the furlough agreement. Can staff remain on furlough at 80% even if we can't claim for them? You wouldn't call it furlough if you weren't going to claim at all. If you were going to claim, you would call it furlough, Paula. Can I change my contracts to include a short time working now and furlough? How do I get an agreement from staff? You obviously could, your furlough agreement, if you've already used it, has already gone out. You potentially could vary your terms and conditions, but I have to say, if I was an employee and my employer presented me with a contract at this time, I probably wouldn't be over impressed to sign it. And I think that's the barrier you're going to have. I think that might be the last of the questions. Yes, it is. Right, anyone want to ask a question live? Pop the word question in and I will turn off your microphone and come to you as we've got another 10 minutes. Anybody got any other questions? Type the word question in the chat box and then I will turn off your microphone and come to you and see what it is you want to ask. Rupan, of course I can trust Rupan to ask a question. Where are you, Rupan? Maybe you can turn yourself off, unmute your own mic, because there you are. Rupan, you are unmuted.
Okay. Right, I don't know if it's a question. I think just, I just want to check that I've understood. So at the end of furlough, I could put people on short time for a week, a couple of weeks, and then I could put them back onto furlough, is that right?
You wouldn't do that. But if you answer your first question at the end of a furlough, if
Yeah,
it comes to an end because the government ends the job retention scheme at the end of
yeah,
June, and you're not open back as normal as you'd like to be,
yeah.
you could decide to put people on short time then.
Okay. But then say if, and I know, sorry, I'm into the realms of who knows, but if the government did then open up another furlough scheme, say if there's a second wave and they decide that everyone has to shut again, and that became available, I
That
would
would
be
be
able
fine.
to do that.
That would be
Okay.
fine. Yeah, that would be fine.
I know we don't know what's going to happen.
We don't know. I feel like I ought to go and get a crystal ball, don't you? I think I ought to give it
Yeah.
and
Okay. All right.
see
Thanks,
what's gonna happen.
Imogen.
You're welcome, my lovely. Kerry, let's open you up. Kerry, do you want to ask your question? Let's try unmute you again. A little delay with this where you...
Oh, is that working?
Yeah, hello, Kerry, I can hear you.
I haven't got my camera on because I'm still in my pajamas after homeschooling 3 kids. So
You have our understanding.
the question is, I've started the consultation process for redundancies yesterday because I know come September when numbers are going to be significantly less because obviously we can't take any new business and because of the obviously percentage of the funding. I have got a member of staff though who has kind of just declared that she is 5 weeks pregnant.
Handy.
Yeah, and she's also been off for a year on sick leave as well. So announced the day that we're going to furlough that she was ready to come back. Then she confirmed that she was pregnant. So she's obviously playing the system. But I'm just wondering, kind of, you said before about if they're pregnant, kind of the redundancy, you've got to be kind of a bit careful. How would that be on there? With obviously she's not kind of.
I mean, I have to say, you're not alone. I think plenty of employees have suddenly decided that they've peed on a stick and had a good news outcome.
Yeah.
Not alone at all. I think one of the employees was told that potentially she wouldn't be furloughed, and immediately went and bought a pregnancy testing kit and did the test there and then, and almost thrust it into the nursery owner's hand to say, "Look at this." Right now, that's just she's told you that she is pregnant, but there's no evidence of the pregnancy.
Yeah.
And obviously that's important because whilst you can't unhear what you've been told, it's not fully been confirmed by a midwife to you that this lady is pregnant. Clearly you would need to have, if you do have any redundancy, if you do select individuals, you would need a really robust selection criteria, Kerry, which in your case, her absence to date has not been pregnancy related.
No, it hasn't.
If you do make a decision based to score her on her absence and it's been absolutely nothing to do with pregnancy, she won't be able to turn around and say that she's been penalised. The things that might be a problem for you, if you were to sort of require them to do training under furlough, I could foresee that somebody who was in the early stage of pregnancy might struggle with that more than somebody who wasn't. So questions would all need to be retrospect, attendance in the year 2019, training completed in 2019, experience in different departments in 2019. So it was all looking that way rather than now.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you very much. That's fantastic.
No worries. If you've not got anybody helping you, do give us a shout because it can be tricky.
I'm stuck in with citation at the moment. I signed a 3-year contract, so.
They'll sort you out, which is the main.
Yeah, but I really appreciate it. Thanks very much.
You're welcome, Kerry. You're welcome. Let's mute you. So can you take somebody off furlough, put them on layoff, and then after 4 weeks? You wouldn't do it, Julie. You really wouldn't. If you're going to have them on furlough, and you're going to decide to stop furloughing, you're going to obviously lay them off and can keep them laid off. Paola saying, can we take staff off furlough? How much notice do we need to give them? I think that was how much notice do we need to give them to take them off furlough? We say 24 hours, Paula, to get somebody to come off furlough. It's what's called reasonable notice period to return from furlough is 24 hours. Harriet, let's go to Harriet. We're getting so much quicker with this technology, aren't we?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Lovely to see
Hello.
What's your question?
Well, my question is that when we first decided to furlough everybody, we just furloughed everybody, apart from a few of us. But now the guidance that came out, was it last night, saying that you have to put a list in of people that you're going to claim on the the job retention scheme money.
Yeah,
and you said earlier that if they're not on that, then they shouldn't really be furloughed. So what do we do about those that we told were on furlough?
Yeah, this was the guidance that came out last night, wasn't it? I can't think where I'm with it. I have to say, I haven't read it in a great deal of detail because I have been on calls all morning before coming on. So yes, you do need to take in consideration as an early years provider any requirement that's been made of you. But I'll have to come back to you on the exact ones of that because I'm just not familiar with what the guidance is. I've got it somewhere. It's printed. I'm just not quite sure where it is. I'll come back to you on that one, Harriet. So
thank you.
Drop me a DM on my Facebook page and I will definitely get back to you on that this afternoon.
Okay.
Sorry I couldn't help. So Atik is saying, is it odd or too generous that I'm paying everyone 80% of their salaries with no government support for not working? Not necessarily odd, Atik, it's just what you've chosen to do because obviously you've got the finances to do so. That's absolutely fine. Marie, we answered your question, so you'll find that in the recording. Seema saying, how much notice do we need to give people to put them on short time? You're basically ending the agreement and putting them on short time if it's already in your contracts, which I think it is. Is there a scoring list for layoff or redundancies? There isn't such thing as a scoring list, Marie, but obviously in terms of redundancies, it's a selection criteria. When it comes to layoff, you just need to make sure that you've fairly selected people. You don't do a selection process as such. Member of staff with less than 2 years service, do we have to go through consultation? If you're making other people redundant, yes, you treat them all the same. The only difference is obviously when they are when they receive their redundancy, they don't receive redundancy pay, but they have still got obviously they've been treated the same, which is important. It benefits the other people as well as you. It makes it look more fair if you've done it all the same way. Is it £30 per day for every day they work as long as it goes on? No, it's just 5 days, so it's £150 maximum is your liability for layoff payments and statutory guarantee payments. Andrew said goodbye. Wanted to ask, do you have a selection process decide who goes on short term? You just got to be fair. You just got to make sure that you've fairly selected people and it's open to scrutiny and you can't be alleged of any discrimination. Again, I can help you with that if you need to. What happens if short-time working layoffs are not already in the contract? Then if they're not in the furlough agreement, then you won't be able to do that unless the staff agree with you, Paula. And that's the last question. Right, well, I think that's been quite a useful session. So if any of you need anything, you know where to get in touch with me. I've just said to Harriet to drop me a DM and I'll get back to her when I find where the guidance has been sat this morning, somewhere in this office. But yeah, if you need anything, folks, you know where I am. And yeah, thank you for all the love that you're all posted on the screen. So sweet, you see, so looked after, aren't I, by my lovely customers. And my lovely group members. But no, thank you very much. I'm now off to record a Zoom with Kate Moxley, who is a specialist in staff wellbeing, and that will be uploaded to our YouTube later today. So those of you who are thinking about wellbeing after lockdown, then please do make sure you check out that video with Kate. And the lovely Rupan did one, I think, on Monday. So yeah, please check out Rupan's video as well, which was about effective leadership. And she gave some great insights into leadership and how it will change and how it's been impacted by all of this. So please check out our videos. Yeah, the recording will be posted up. We'll do a bit of editing, tidy it up, and we'll post the video. And if you need anything, you know where we are. Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.